Dustin Partridge talk about green roof tax abatement. Dustin is the senior ecologist and green infrastructure lead and New York City Audubon managing director. And he's also from the Green Roof Researchers Alliance. So take it away, Dustin.
Thank you, Holly. Share my screen. Yeah, so thank you for that introduction. I'm going to be talking today about green roofs in New York City. It's a large focus of my work at New York City Audubon, and it's really the entire focus of the GRRA, which is the Green Roof Researchers Alliance, where I'm the managing director. And that's a consortium of over 80 researchers and advocates across the city from over 20 and 25 institutions that are working to basically understand how green roofs function in New York City and how to get more of them. So you see this image here. This is not the reality at the moment. We're far from this, but it's an optimistic view of what could happen. So I'm going to start out by giving an overview of green roofs in case there are a few in the conference that aren't familiar with them. So when you look at New York City from this view, it seems challenging to increase green space at any significant amount because of the sheer amount of impervious surface. And a lot of what you see just looking down on this is rooftop space, which is why we're interested in what happens when you turn this, which is just a typical green roof, a typical conventional roof in the city, into this, which is a green roof. And this is a building in the Bronx. These are just two opposite sides of the same roof, and you can see what a difference it is. At a very basic level, a green roof is a vegetated rooftop, but realistically, they're highly engineered environments. They require a lot of structural engineering to get onto the roof, but when it comes down to how they function as habitats. They capture stormwater and they have a lot of benefits. They have several important layers. Really the ones that are of interest to this conversation are vegetation, soil, and the drainage and filter layer. They do have a layer of rigid insulation and then a root barrier, and this is all on top of a building. And you can see what this looks like on the right-hand side when you lift up just the vegetation. And they are pretty amazing systems that are put up on top of buildings. The soil and the drainage layer in this case are really what's responsible for capturing stormwater, which is the focus of today. So in terms of the industry terms for green roofs, they kind of split the green roofs into two main types: extensive roofs, which are generally shallow, and then deep roofs, which are termed intensive. So extensive roofs tend to be less than 6 inches, and you can see an image of that here. These green roofs are cheaper to install. They require far less maintenance. They weigh a lot less, which is an important aspect when considering where green roofs and what type of green roofs can be installed on buildings. So they're a good option, but they also tend to be limited in their vegetation structure because of that depth. So, for example, most green roofs in New York City that are extensive are planted with this succulent called sedum, and you can see this blown up here. Now, there are a few shallow roofs that are experimenting with native plants, and that's been an interesting development to see how that goes. Now, on the opposite side of that, you have deep roofs or intensive roofs. And these roofs have over 6 inches, and they can obviously host a greater diversity of plants because of that deeper substrate. They weigh a lot more, they're more intensive to manage, and they're more expensive to install. But as you can see, the plant diversity is much greater than you would typically have on an extensive roof. And these are important factors to consider when you're looking at the benefits of green roofs. Now, that overview of extensive versus intensive is very generalized. There are many different types of green roofs in the city and across the world. So, for example, here you have a farm in Greenpoint. That's becoming more popular in New York, is actually using rooftops for agriculture. And there are various benefits associated with that. On the other hand, over here, you have a combined solar and green roof, which Shino had mentioned, and I'll talk a bit about more coming up. But this is an important development in that solar panel units they function better on green roofs because green roofs cool the air around the solar units, and they're higher performance when it's cooler out. And the solar units actually convey some benefit to green roofs because they create a little microhabitat that you can see in the shaded area here, where you can have a diversity of different plants than would be in this highly exposed environment. And this is a green roof in the winter. So that's why it looks the way it does. Now, I mentioned benefits. Green roofs have a number of benefits. Today, we're talking about stormwater, and they can do that through capture in the substrate, the growing media, which is a highly engineered. It's not just soil taken off of the ground. These growing media are designed to be lightweight and hold extra water. And then there are membranes beneath it that are designed for storing water, and that also is what is used by the plants to continue surviving. So green roofs do a great job at capturing water on the roof, but then also slowing down the rate at which they leave the roof. As Sheena pointed out, there are some massive conventional roofs in the city where water just hits that impervious surface and goes right into the stormwater system. Where green roofs are, is it slows down that output really rapidly. An example of this. So this is the Javits Center, which is a 7-acre green roof in Manhattan. And this is about as shallow of a roof as you can have in New York City. So this is 1.5 inches of growing media, and it's kind of that bare minimum of what's needed to survive. But even in this roof, which is super shallow, there have been pretty enormous benefits, specifically for stormwater. So this roof retains 55% of the precipitation that hits the roof over the course of a season. And of small events, it retains about 96% of the small events that hit the roof. And this is data from out of Drexel. I'm looking at this. This roof also has a number of other benefits associated with it, such as it's an enormous wildlife habitat with over 35 migrating birds there now. Other benefits associated with green roofs include the reduced heating and cooling needs. So this is done through energy savings. It also reduces fossil fuel use, and this is done through insulation and HVAC intakes. So this green roof cools the air, and on a 90-degree day, this air near the HVAC intakes is going to be 90 degrees. If these intakes were on a conventional blacktop roof, that air around the intakes could be up to 140 degrees. So that difference in cooling needs, it makes a big difference in terms of how much energy is used to cool the building. Similarly, the green roofs with that cooling aspect reduce their urban heat island. And that's a big issue in New York. What you see here is the heat vulnerability index, and the deeper red colors that are located in these areas are the areas that have the highest rate of heat-related mortality. And it's a big issue that green roofs can help offset, especially at a larger scale. Now, I'm from New York City Audubon, so I have to acknowledge wildlife habitat. And you can see that these green roofs do provide ample habitat for birds, bats, and native insects. Other benefits for the building include increased roof lifespan, they reduce noise, they improve air quality, and they have social benefits. This is Kings of Wildflowers, which was mentioned by Sheena. And this functions as essentially a living laboratory or a classroom where students can go out there and experience the outdoors and study what's happening. If you're interested in more information about green roof benefits or how green roofs function, you can visit our GRRA website, which is greenroofsnyc.com. But so now I'm going to switch gears and talk about where green roofs are. So to be honest, New York is very, very far behind the rest of the world. You can see an image here of Stuttgart, Germany, and every one of those red stars is a green roof. They've had a mandate in place for years, and it's been adopted very well. And you can see how many green roofs have been installed and how different this is than New York City. Green roofs are thriving in Singapore and Toronto, and in the US, Chicago, Portland, DC, and Denver are really winning the green roof race. In New York City, we have far fewer. Based on data from the Nature Conservancy, this work was led by the Nature Conservancy. They found that as of 2016, from 2016 remote sensing imagery, there are 736 green roofs in New York City. So that might sound like a lot, and this image over here with all of the dots might look like a lot, but it's less than 0.1% of New York City buildings. So we have a lot further to go. And I'm going to zoom in a bit now and show you what this reality actually looks like. It looks nice with the larger dots, but when you zoom in close, we're going to focus on lower Manhattan here, which has the highest density of green roofs. And you can see what that actually looks like. So there are a number of green roofs down here, but there is still so much space to grow. There are so many the vast majority of the city is these unused rooftop space where stormwater is just hitting and rolling off and entering our system. So there's a lot of room for growth. And now keep in mind, this is the densest area, this midtown and downtown Manhattan, where the majority of green roofs are focused. If you start looking elsewhere, like North Brooklyn and into Queens, you can see that there are very few green roofs outside of certain neighborhoods like Williamsburg or Long Island City. They're very rare in most of the city. This is South Brooklyn, where there's serious need, but they're really absent. And this is the Bronx in northern Manhattan. And you can see that there are very few throughout the city. Now, this is again the distribution across the city and how it aligns with potential environmental justice areas. It's kind of alarming. So you can see where they're mostly concentrated in Midtown and downtown, and you can see where the DEC environmental justice areas are laid out. And you can see how there's very little overlap. So there is a need to get more green roofs outside of just Midtown and downtown. Here you can see the number of green roofs. In Manhattan, it's 63% of the buildings, 63% of the city's roofs are in Manhattan, whereas very few are in the outer boroughs. In terms of square footage, it's about the same of 60% of the green roof square footage is in Manhattan, with very few in the outer boroughs. Now, this also is resulting in possible unequal distribution of benefits. So we've been tracking green roofs installed since 2016 through a survey and examining them. And preliminary data indicate that in Manhattan and certain areas of Brooklyn, they have a greater depth, a greater plant richness, and a greater average size than the rest of the city. So those benefits I talked about are all related to depth, plant richness, and size. And we're seeing that these benefits are only really being conferred in certain neighborhoods that have access to these green roofs. So how do we increase green roofs in New York City? Well, we have two policies in place. There are local laws 92 and 94, which are the mandate. So this is the stick. They mandate green roofs or solar on all new buildings. I'm going to talk about this in just a moment, and then we're going to talk about the green roof tax abatement, which is the incentive program, offering up to $15 per square foot. So the local laws came in place as part of the Climate Mobilization Act. And what the law states is new buildings and additions where the entire existing roof deck or roof assembly is being replaced must provide a sustainable roofing zone covering 100% of the roof. Now, in plain English, what that means is New York City requires green roofs or solar roofs or a combination on all new rooftops. So this law requires solar or green roofs or a combination of both on all new rooftops. This applies to any new construction as of November 5th, 2019, and it applies for the full decking or assembly replacement. If you're just replacing the membrane, you don't get, this law does not get triggered. It's only if you're doing real structural work. And in that case, then you will have to install a solar roof or a green roof or a combination thereof. And it applies to all building types and sizes, although alternative compliance for affordable housing for 5 years after 2019. So I mentioned the requirements. It's a green roof or solar or both, and it must cover all available roof space. Now, there are exemptions to what available roof space means, and essentially excludes all areas with structure. So any structures that are necessary for building function on the roof are excluded from this law. It also excludes FDNY access pathways, zoning setbacks, recreational spaces that are already recorded, and it's not necessary for roofs if you're not going to be able to install less than 200 square feet of green roof, or if you're not going to be able, if you can't produce more than 4 kilowatts of solar capacity. So if you fall within that realm of not being able to produce enough solar or green roof, then you can be exempt. But if, for example, you do not have enough space to have a green roof, but you can produce solar, then you are still required. And where a green roof is not feasible, solar is required, and vice versa. So that's the mandate. Now let's talk about the incentive program. So this green roof tax abatement in New York City has a pretty interesting and long history. It's been in place since 2008, largely due to the efforts of SWIM. So SWIM saw this back in 2008, which required amazing foresight because back then there were very few green roofs in New York City, and got this initially in place. But due to a number of issues, there was little upticks. So between 2008 and 2018, 7 roofs were built using this green roof tax abatement. And that was largely due to not enough funding for the program and the amount of essentially paperwork that was needed to get this abatement through for people having it installed. So once this initial abatement expired, we were interested in different ways to improve it. So we had updates passed in 2019, and the questions here were, how do we increase use around the green roof tax abatement? How do we get people to actually start using these funds that are available? And then also, how do we increase the use in areas other than downtown and midtown Manhattan? Because we had concerns that if this green roof tax abatement became more accessible to people, it would just get devoured by development in midtown and downtown, and further making the inequity of green roofs as we move forward. So one of the ideas on how to fight this distribution of roofs was to offer a higher tax abatement rate to areas in need of green roofs. So this came from Danielle Spiegelfeld at NYU, and she suggested looking towards a location-specific tax incentive, essentially identifying neighborhoods that could really use green roofs and offer more money to those neighborhoods to incentivize development. So working with a large group of people and organizations, the green roof tax abatement was updated in 2019. And these improvements were included updating to consider priority community districts. And it increased the abatement rate, which was essential. So priority community districts received $15 per square foot. And that $15 was kind of the estimate as to what would be the bare minimum that would spur use of this program and really offset some of the costs, because installing green roofs in New York City is expensive. Non-priority areas are still able to apply for the abatement, but the rate remains unchanged at $5.23 a square foot. Now, these priority areas were decided by MOS, considering these two main criteria. So looking at heat vulnerability from the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, this index is an analysis of heat-related mortality based on neighborhood characteristics such as green space, poverty, daytime summer surface temperatures, and households reporting air conditioning, that map that I showed you before. They also considered priority areas to be areas that are within CSO priority districts, and this was designated by DEP. And you can see what these two main criteria overlap. So these are the priority CSO tributary areas, and this is the heat vulnerability index. So you can see where these central areas overlap, and this is really where there aren't any green roofs at this point. So these areas were designated to be priority areas. MOS ended up deciding that 15 community districts are in priority districts, and you can see them here. These yellow colors are the priority districts that receive $15 per square foot. If you're curious, or you have friends or colleagues that are curious what the abatement rate is, you can go to our website, which is greenroofsnyc.com/financing options, and you can find this wonderful tool that was developed by the Nature Conservancy that will tell you the rate of abatement for your district. So you can enter in your address and find out your building's rate. Now, the funding for this program, we have $15 per square foot in priority community districts. In non-priority districts, it's still $5.23 a square foot. There are some caps though. So the benefit cap per building at this stage is $200,000, which should be more. The program cap per year is $1 million. So there are funds available right now that can be used for just increasing the number of green roofs in the city. However, we do have improvements that there are better ways to get this abatement available. So some necessary improvements that we'd like to see. Increase funding. That $15 is good, but it would be much better if there was more. Green roofs confer a public benefit. They're not just for stormwater, but for all of the other aspects that I mentioned. So there should be some funding to increase their development across the city. I'd like to see the priority rates increase, as well as that citywide rate increased. Increasing the number of priority areas. So other areas that don't have access to green roofs it would be great to see them have access to this increased abatement rate. This is a little bit of detail, but at that stage, green roofs that are applying for the green roof tax abatement need to be over 4 inches. and striking or reducing this requirement would be really helpful in terms of getting greeners installed throughout the city. And then, of course, we also need some updating to city resources. So what you see here is actually the greener tax abatement program as listed by the DOB. And you can see that it hasn't been updated since 2018. And it's stated as the abatement program ended on March 15th, 2018. So if people are interested in going to find out about this greener tax abatement and they end up in the DOB page, this is what they're going to see. So there is conflicting information from the city. And that needs to change to get this program used. With that, I need to acknowledge that this has been a Herculean effort from many different partners. So you can see all of the organizations on this page here. It's been an amazing exercise in collaboration and pushing through legislation that's really beneficial for the city. I want to special note that Emily Maxwell from the Nature Conservancy has been leading this kind of coalition since 2020, and it's been just fantastic work. So thank you to all of you here. And I want to give special thanks to DEP and the Mayor's Office of Climate and Sustainability. They were really helpful in getting through those this law initially passed in 2019 and working on understanding and deciding where the priority districts are. But I do want to acknowledge that Assemblymember Neely Rozic and Senator John Liu have been the major supporters of this legislation, and they continue to be. So special thanks to them for being able to get greeners throughout the city. And with that, I'll take any questions.